Hello, had a little costume change, had to put on my real crown. So this is chapter 43 of Pride and Prejudice. And this is probably going to take a little while. We're going to have a lot of discussion on this one. Hopefully my crown's not going to slip. If it does, I bobby pinned it in, but it works. I'm sure that even the Queen has had, issues with her tiara, so I understand it. Let's look at question number 1. Describe Elizabeth's impressions of Pemberley. And this is something that's kind of important. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. It's interesting because this is the chapter, ladies and gentlemen, where I told you about Mark Twain and how Mark Twain was not a fan of Jane Austen, poor guy, and how he did not like Elizabeth Bennet. He thought Elizabeth Bennet was a gold digger. Ba-na-na-na. And unfortunately, he's wrong, obviously. Sorry, Mark Twain. But he didn't understand why she was reacting the way that she was reacting. And if you look at question number 2, what is the significance of Elizabeth enjoying the beauty of the grounds of Pemberley so much? It wasn't just because it was a beautiful estate. She had seen beautiful estates. She was just at Rosings Park, right? Elizabeth is not a gold digger. The fact is, and she even comments on it a little bit later on, and when I get to that, I'll refresh your memory that I spoke about it earlier. But she even talks about how she's never seen someplace so properly situated and just so perfect for its location. Think about it. I want you to think about yourself. Right now, you might be sitting in your room. I'm in my office reading or doing this. I want you to think about your surrounding. And I want you to think, if people walked into your bedroom right now, this very second, if people walked into your room, would they know what you liked? Do you have posters up on the wall? Do you have clothes strewn all over the floor? Do you have books next to your bed? Do you have a TV? Do you have an Xbox? Do you have a PS4? What is in your room? How would people know who you were just by what was in your room? And that is kind of what's happening to Elizabeth here with Pemberley, where she is seeing Mr. Darcy's natural habitat, if you will. Your room is your natural habitat, right? And she's seeing him for the first time. He's not there at this point. You've read the rest of the chapter, you know what happens. But she's recognizing, and this is months later, she's recognizing obviously that she was wrong, but she's really starting to see him for who he is. This is months after he proposed to her, a few months. I have to look at my timeline. I apologize. I don't want to scramble through, but this is a few months after he's proposed to her. So they haven't seen each other. She's never thought she was ever going to see him again, that she would ever interact with him again. And it's a very moving moment for her to recognize that not only was she wrong, but he's such a good man, and his estate is such a reflection upon him. And I want to once again reread what I just said at the beginning, and I apologize, my pages are turning. Elizabeth was delighted. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. There was no artificial appearance. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. And I want to I'm going to go back and reread a little bit more about the house itself. It was a large, handsome stone building standing well on risen ground and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. She's recognizing that that's Mr. Darcy. The way that the house was just described was Mr. Darcy. He is, if we were talking about Pemberley House, he was large, he was handsome, a stone building. If he was stonish, he was very formal. He seemed rigid and cold. He was up higher than everybody else, standing well on a high ground, backed by a ridge of woody hills. So there were people behind him backing him up, I guess you could say, if we're talking about symbolism here. And a stream of some natural importance was swelled into something greater. So it's almost like this pomposity about him. but there's no artificial appearance. He didn't look fake. Even though she thought Mr. Darcy was a jerk in the beginning half of the novel, she still recognized that he was what he was. He never pretended to be something he was not, like Wickham. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. And she's starting to recognize that Pemberley is Mr. Darcy. They are synonymous with one another. Okay, let's look at question number 2. What is the significance? I'm sorry, question number 3. What does Elizabeth realize about Pemberley? She realizes, and of all of this place, I could have been mistress. She's looking around the beautiful grounds. She's looking around at everything during her visit to Pemberley, and she's like, wow, this could be my home. I could be in charge of all of this. This beautiful house, these servants, these grounds. This could be my home. And so she kind of not does a double take, so to speak. I know you're watching my pearls jiggle. She doesn't do a double take, but she really just, it's more self-reflection time for her. It's more character development. It's an evolution of her character once again. I really dig books that the characters evolve, as you can tell. Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre. Let's continue on with the next question, darlings. Number 4, what thought saved her from regret? The thought that saved her from regret was, oh, I'm just glad I didn't marry him because he would never allow me to see my family. My aunt and uncle would be strangers to me. My whole family would be strangers to me. And remember, you're like, oh, heck no, my husband wouldn't. At that time, the wife was the property of the husband. So she did what he said. And if he said you cannot see them, then you cannot see them. That's just how it was. Let's go ahead and continue on with the next question. Number 5, describe Mrs. Reynolds' description of Mr. Darcy. And I'm going to read this one to you, not just because I have a melodious voice that always put Marshall Martins to sleep, or nicking, depending on what class period you're in. But Mr. and Mrs. Gardner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, it is very much to his credit. I am sure that you should think so. Because Mrs. Reynolds says, I do not know anyone that would be good enough to marry my master. And she says, Mrs. Reynolds, the servant, then says, I say no more than the truth, and what everybody else will say that knows him. Elizabeth thought that this was going a little bit too far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old. That was praise most extraordinary. And I want you to think about why. Why is that praise most extraordinary? And we're going to get back to that in a second, but I do want you to think about that. Mr. Gardner replies, there are very few people of whom so much can be said. And you are in luck having such a master. And Mrs. Reynolds says, yes, sir, I know I am. If I was to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up. And he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. And Elizabeth is like, this can't be Mr. Darcy. And Mrs. Gardner, Aunt Gardner, makes the comment, his father was an excellent man. And Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, replies, yes, ma'am, that he was, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor. Now, some of you might say to yourself, hold up, how does Mrs. Gardner know anything about Mr. Darcy's father, the elder Mr. Darcy? Remember, the elder Mr. Darcy owns the largest estate in the area, so that estate is responsible for taking care of the local communities, okay? So if a bridge goes out, the community probably wouldn't have enough money, pooling it together to build a new bridge. They would look to the local landowners, and Mr. Darcy, it would be his responsibility to help keep the businesses and the cities and the towns surrounding his estate going. And so everybody knew who the Darcys were. That's why when they were at the inn, Elizabeth asked the chambermaid, do you know if the family is in town? Well, the estate is so large that most likely people all over the town, family members worked at the estate, either as a gardener or as a kitchen help or as a servant or as a chambermaid there. That estate took a lot of people in order for it to grow and function and work. And so everybody knows the business. I mean, we all know everybody's business in Galt, right? G-Tone. But we have to recognize that with such a grand estate, they were celebrities in their neck of the woods. So of course, Mrs. Gardner is going to know who they are. But I want you to think about back to what Mrs. Reynolds said, back to what the servant said, okay? And I want to put you in a position. I want you to think about this. Those of you that work, think about your bosses. You might love your boss. You might hate your boss. Think about your teachers. I know you're all students. You might love your teachers. You might hate your teachers, whatever. But if you didn't have a reason to badmouth somebody, you wouldn't. And if a situation came about for you to give accolades to somebody, you would. But you also have to think of the situation. She's walking through the house with strangers. She's showing the strangers their home. And it was very normal at that time. I mean, nowadays people go on visits to the White House or Hearst Castle, for example. It was very common back then. They would pay the housekeeper a small fee, not a fee, I'm sorry. They would pay her a small tip. Thank you so much for taking us through the house. And the people, the owners of the house, wanted neighborhood individuals to come through their house when it was a certain season, because they wanted those people to see, this is what all your work has given our community and given our family, and we're very grateful for it. So our house, in a sense, is your house also. That is, once again, why we get to go through the White House, because our money, our taxes, pays for that house. Now we can't go running willy-nilly through the White House and, do somersaults and backflips and stuff. I'm sure people would try, but Evan Sylvie, you really shouldn't do that. But they still had that separation. But Mrs. Reynolds didn't have to say anything kind about Mr. Darcy. So that says a lot, because these are strangers. These aren't local people visiting the home. So she's never going to see them again. And the fact that Mrs. Reynolds, if they asked, oh, do you like your master? She could have said, yes, he's a good man, and just kept walking and left it at that. But instead, she goes on and on about how wonderful he is, and she's so effusive about him and her accolades. She didn't have to do that. That is significant. And that really surprises Elizabeth, because Elizabeth knows this woman didn't have to say anything. She doesn't know that I have any connection to Mr. Darcy, that I thought ill of him at the beginning of the book. So I want you to think about that. That also helps Elizabeth evolve in her perception of Mr. Darcy. Let's continue on while I take a drink of water. Number 6. Oh, I think this is a good one. Question number 6, and I apologize. My book keeps flopping open. Here's my book. I have to show my book every single time. Let's go ahead and open up to page, well, I'm 482. I don't know what page you are. But Mrs. Reynolds then says, he is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived, not like the wild young men nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men. Mrs. Reynolds is saying Mr. Darcy is not like other young guys. He isn't. He doesn't party. He doesn't go out gambling. He doesn't go out with his friends. He has responsibilities. Even for other men his age, he takes his responsibilities seriously. I want you to think back right now, and I want you to compare Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice to John Reed from Jane Eyre that we read first semester. Big difference, right? Remember John Reed? He was also the lone master of the estate. He inherited the estate at a young age. What did he do? He was cruel to the servants. He broke the necks of the chicks in the hen house. He gambled away almost his entire inheritance. His sisters, luckily, their dowries were safe, as well as his mother's inheritance, but his mother kept giving him money. He was spoiled. He was conceited. He was cruel. That was the kind of guy that Mrs. Reynolds in Pride and Prejudice is saying, there's other guys like that, but Mr. Darcy is not like that. That is the norm. Mr. Darcy is not the norm. And so that is why Mrs. Reynolds say, I don't know any other man that's as good as him. And so Elizabeth is like, whoa, maybe she's right. I have sorely misjudged him. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's continue on. We're almost at the 15-minute mark, which I'm normally almost done with all, or I am done with all the questions by now, but we got a lot to go. So bear with me on this one, darlings. Number 7, why did Elizabeth feel Mrs. Reynolds' praise was important? Because Mrs. Reynolds was a servant and she didn't have to praise. Just as I mentioned previously, she didn't have to say anything nice. She didn't have to say anything bad. She didn't have to say anything at all. She could have just done her job and showed them the house and sent them on their merry way and made her little, £1 or her farthing or whatever amount they were going to pay her. Number 8, looking at his portrait in the gallery, why did she have a deeper sentiment of gratitude for him? This, I think, once again, is just a boom. Elizabeth Bennet is just totally sucked into reality on this one. And I love this. She thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth and softened its propriety of expression. She realized, wow, thank you so much. Thank you, Fitzwilliam Darcy, that have come from this, world. Yes, you are a gentleman and I am a gentleman's daughter, but our worlds are so different. They're so vastly separated by chasms, huge chasms. And she's saying, thank you. Thank you for thinking that I was good enough. And now she's starting to think about his proposal. And she's like, thank you for recognizing that I am more than what my family represented. Thank you for being willing to put aside the shame and the degradation that my family would have brought to you because you loved me. So thank you. And she's looking at his picture, thinking this in the portrait gallery, and she's like, wow, thank you for seeing the value in me that no one else may ever see. Obviously, Mr. Collins didn't see it. He was just looking for a wife. Mr. Darcy has his pick of anyone. And he picked her, and she's starting to see just the true depth. It wasn't a rich man wanting something that he couldn't have. It was a true affection. And she was grateful for that he saw her for who she was. We're coming up to the good stuff. Okay. Now, question number 9. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, question number 9. So, they finish the tour of the house. They're out and about. And as they're walking around, who comes around the corner from the stables but Mr. Darcy? What? Holy smokes. Oh my goodness. Where did Mr. Darcy come from? Question number 9, he came from the stables. Number 10, what was his response to seeing Elizabeth? I love this, and I'm going to tell you right now. So when you see the 5-hour version, the Colin Firth version, which I pray and hope we get to watch together. If not, I will have you watch it, and then I'm going to have specific pointed questions on specific points of the movie to have you respond to. But this is one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. I'm not even going to lie. I'm not going to lie. This summer when we were at Lime Park, where they shot the movie, and it was Mr. Darcy's Pemberley in the 95 version, I recreated the scene because I was so excited and I loved it. And my husband's a good man. And he sat there like this, Miss Bennet. And I'm like, Mr. Darcy. So obviously I have a good husband. He really is a good man. He's a good guy. All right. So question number 10, he absolutely started and for a moment seemed immovable by surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. So of course he's going to be very civil. He's going to be very kind to her. Not going to be very composed because he's a little bit shocked. He's at his house, a place where he has dreamed or had dreamt that Elizabeth would one day be the mistress of. And all of a sudden there she is. And he's like, he's shocked. He doesn't know what to do. Question number 11, how did Elizabeth respond to Mr. Darcy's inquiries about her family? They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries about her family. So she just responded. She didn't even know what she was saying. She was just as nervous as him. Let's go ahead and continue. Question number 12. Okay, so yeah, we're in August right now. Sorry, we're in August and this is April. So this is months before. This is months past when he proposed. He did not seem much more at ease when he spoke. His accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries of the time of her having left Longbourn and of her stay in Derbyshire so often and so hurried away as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. So question number 12, he kept repeating himself. He kept asking her the same question. He's like, oh, and where are you staying? Oh, yeah. And where are you staying again? Oh, yeah. I mean, not like right after the other because he's not like losing his mind, but he would ask her a question and then they would like small talk, chit chat for a minute. And then he'd go, oh, and where are you staying? Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. So he was totally distracted. Question number 13, obviously that indicates that he is just flummoxed. He doesn't know what to do because she's there. Let's look at 14. What did you think Mr. Darcy would assume about her being at Pemberley? She was so worried that he would think that she was like a gold digger, that she found out how wealthy he really was. And she came to like look around and kind of be nosy Nelly about the whole thing. And she was just mortified. And this is the scene that I reacted or recreated when we were there. There's a scene in the book when Mr. Darcy walks away. He's like, oh, good day. And he like leaves, or he goes, excuse me. And he leaves and Mr. and Mrs. Gardner are waiting and they like walk down a few steps and they're like, oh, the man himself. And Mrs. Gardner's like, just as handsome as his portrait, even though he's a little less formally attired. And Elizabeth goes, oh, we gotta leave here at once. We must leave here at once. And so she's like, oh, she's so nervous because she doesn't want him to think that she's a gold digger, but that's obviously what a normal person would think. Like, you rejected me and now you're just coming to see what you should have had. Remember how Mr. Collins was doing that to Elizabeth? She thinks it's the same. Number 15, her thoughts were all, what things did Elizabeth long to know at that moment? Darcy went into Pemberley and she and her aunt and uncle continued their walk around the grounds. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, wherever it might be, where Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at that moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether in defiance of everything she was still dear to him. So she was worried. She was like, okay, well, he's somewhere. Does he still love me? Is he thinking about me? Is he thinking I'm a gold digger? We got to get out of here. So let's go ahead. I'll look at question 16. What was the distance around the whole estate? Wasn't it 10 miles? Yeah, 10 miles around. Zoinks! That's like from Galt out to Rancho Seco, okay? All the way around. The circumference. Holy smokes. Calculus, do the math. How many acres is that? Seriously? How many acres? Send me a remind. Somebody. Let's look at number 17. Why were they cutting their walk short and going back to the carriage? Because Mrs. Gardner was not a good walker. And she was like, I'm tired. This is way too much walking. Number 18. Why did she stop complimenting Pemberley's beauty to Mr. Darcy? Okay, so Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy comes up and she's like, go with it. Don't act stupid. And she's like, hi. And so they started talking and she's talking about how beautiful the estate was. And then she realized, you sound just like Caroline Bingley, shut your mouth. And so she didn't want to sound like Caroline Bingley. She didn't want to sound like she was just fawning all over his estate. And that's why she stopped complimenting. Number 19, who did Mr. Darcy say would be arriving tomorrow? People that Elizabeth knew, and his sister, Georgiana. So the Bingley, Mr. Bingley, and his sisters, as well as Darcy's sister, Georgiana. Here we go. Question number 20. Describe the difference in tone of Darcy's question regarding Elizabeth to Georgiana as opposed to when he proposed. Okay, ready? I know I'm at 23 minutes. You guys are great. I probably have about maybe 5 more minutes. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambton? Okay. He's asking her permission. When he proposed, it was understood. He knew she was going to say yes. But she didn't. So he's humbled. This shows that he's humbled, number 1. Number 2, you and I, and Elizabeth, we know what Georgiana's done. Georgiana almost eloped. Now remember, if that gets out, her reputation is completely ruined. Even though she didn't elope, it would still be ruined. So Mr. Darcy, recognizing that, and if you remember, guilty by association. So he is asking Elizabeth permission to see if she would be willing to meet his sister. Not, hey, my sister's better than you, so you want to meet her? It wasn't that. It was, are you willing to meet my sister? Do I ask too much? I love how he says it too. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much to introduce my sister to your acquaintance? Elizabeth could have said no. If she had said no, obviously it would indicate she is not interested in him at all. She has no kind feelings, let alone romantic feelings towards him. But it also would indicate that Elizabeth feels that Georgiana is a little bit soiled. And Elizabeth doesn't want to be soiled by association in case it ever got out. And so to have Elizabeth say to Darcy, I would be honored to meet your sister. That indicated to Darcy that Elizabeth was the person that he always knew she was. And she was the kind person, she was caring, and she would be wonderful as a good companion and a friend for Georgiana. So whether or not anything else is going to happen, he's also seeing that she's treating him a little bit differently here. She's not snarky and snotty to him at all. You guys are great. 25 minutes and 40 seconds. You guys are awesome of this lecture. I'm almost done though. Number 21, why would it be a compliment to the highest kind for Elizabeth to be introduced to Georgiana? Because she is Georgiana Darcy. Whereas before, Elizabeth is like, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, no big deal, Georgiana Darcy. But she's Georgiana Darcy, and that means a few things. Item number 1, she's from one of the most illustrious families in all of England. Item number 2, she's Darcy's sister. Item number 3, actually a subcategory of item number 2, is that as Darcy's sister, he protects her. He doesn't let her meet just anybody anymore. She is on lockdown. And so Darcy obviously values Elizabeth, and that's what he's indicating by asking Elizabeth if she would be willing to meet Georgiana. He is saying, I value you. Would you be willing to meet my sister? And so that shows that he might still have feelings for her, because he could have just said, hey, peace out, I'm done, after he saw her at the stables and stayed in his house. But he doesn't. He comes back out, which allows hope to start kindling within Elizabeth. Number 22, what did Elizabeth tell her aunt and uncle in the carriage after leaving Pemberley? Because they were saying how this Mr. Darcy is not at all like Mr. Wickham, or that you described him. And she says by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Wickham so amiable as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied upon. So Elizabeth told her aunt and uncle, I understand from having met Mr. Darcy's relations in Kent, that Mr. Darcy did pay Mr. Wickham £3,000 upon him removing himself from the living at Kimpton, and another £1,000 that my father willed him. So, or not but Mr. Darcy's father. So I think that Mr. Darcy's a better person than we actually thought. Look at number 23. Why didn't Elizabeth pay attention to the new friend she made through Mrs. Gardiner? And this really goes back also, it coincides with number 24, because all she could think about was Darcy. She couldn't get him out of her mind. She just couldn't stop thinking about him at all. Ladies and gentlemen, you are so dang patient. 28 minutes. Whew, that's a lot of time. Thank you so much for listening. If you even got all the way through, if you did get all the way through, send me a remind of what your favorite candy is, and I will give you, I wish I could give it to you, I'm sorry, but I will give you a high five. Just kidding. I'll give you an extra point, extra credit. Have a great day, guys. Love you. Please stay safe.